Hey everyone, this is Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. Today I am going to give you a look at a webinar that I did almost a year ago now on Uranus's entrance into the sign of Gemini. I did this a long time ago as a way of previewing what this major outer planetary shift would look like. And here we are today, July 7th of 2025, and Uranus is finally entering Gemini. I know that a lot of you have attended or have been interested in my monthly webinars. And this is also an opportunity for me to just show you and show the audience who watches this channel regularly what one of my monthly webinars look like. So I hope that you will enjoy this kind of reshare of a monthly webinar that I did, again, almost a year ago now on Uranus's entrance into the sign of Gemini. Before we get into that, as always, remember to like and subscribe. It's my hope that today's talk, all of the talks we do on this channel are like a form of spiritual practice. And if that's the case for you and you're here regularly, your like and subscribe go a long way to helping us grow and sustain ourselves. You can find transcripts of any of these daily talks on the website, of course, which is nightlightastrology.com. When you are over there, speaking of monthly webinars, I want to share with you the upcoming webinar that I am doing on the 9th house this Thursday night. So if you go over to live events, click on events, live talks, scroll down, you'll see this Thursday night. If you like this webinar that I'm replaying for you today, then consider coming out and learning about the 9th house Thursday night. We're going to talk about why Indian astrologers believe that this house contains some of our best karma. Why is that the case? And also, how can you work with and understand your own 9th house better? This will be a talk that I think a lot of you will really enjoy. If you can't make it live for this talk, you get the link to the webinar when you register. But if you can't attend live, we'll give you the replay link later so that you can watch or listen on your own time. And that's the case for all of our talks. The rest of the talks for the entirety of the year are now listed, so you can check those out and register for any of them that you like. Hope to see you there. So I thought, what better way to celebrate Uranus entering Gemini than give you a nice, long, really in-depth, deeply researched presentation that I did on the subject. I hope you will enjoy it. And also, this gives you a feel for what my monthly webinars are like. You're going to get some of the deeper, more substantive conference-style talks. Any of these talks are talks that I could easily bring and give at conferences. So the level of research and professionalism that goes into designing them and making them is several steps above, like daily YouTube content, and is really meant for, let's say, not total beginners, more like, intermediate level or even advanced. But I think especially when it comes to the exploration of the outer planets moving signs, I did one with Neptune in Aquarius, or Pluto in Aquarius, Neptune in Aries, Saturn in Aries. This one, Uranus in Gemini. Again, I hope that you will enjoy it. And we will I'll be doing a planets in profile episode on Venus in Gemini as well tomorrow. Remember, interesting today to start the week that Venus is also trining Pluto. So it's a big start to the week. Uranus entering Gemini is definitely the headline though. So I hope you'll enjoy this. Okay. Well, I'm very excited to be here and to have a chance to look at what is arguably one of the biggest transits of next year in Uranus's ingress into the sign of Gemini. I'm going to put a presentation up on the screen. I believe this will probably take me maybe around an hour, although when it's my first time giving a presentation, I'm never sure how long it's going to take, 60 to 90 minutes, somewhere in there. After that, we'll open up for Q&A, and I'll just go until it feels like we've reached a nice spot for the evening, and we'll end it there. So Uranus's entrance into Gemini, I've titled this talk Chaos, Mind, and Magic, because I think that these are some of the most exciting qualities of Uranus in Gemini on an archetypal level that we are going to see and that we can look forward to. And I'll say more about that as we get on with things here. But the purpose of the talk, very clear and simple. Let's take a look at the symbolism, archetypal symbolism of Uranus in Gemini prior to Uranus entering Gemini next year. Uranus will enter Gemini for the first time a year from right now in July of 2025, and it will not finish its stay in Gemini until May of 2033. Because of a little bit of retrograding back into Taurus that will happen between 2025 and 6, it looks like Uranus is going to spend 8 years in Gemini, but it actually spends only about 7. In my opinion, if we prepare ourselves, especially for slower moving transits, whether it's, to me, it's sort of like Jupiter through Pluto. Jupiter's going to spend a year in a sign. We ought to spend some time really reflecting on what that might be like to have a planet in a sign for an entire year. So I think we should do the same thing for the outer planets. And I am very excited to be thinking about Uranus in Gemini after almost 7 long years of Uranus and Taurus. I also believe that by prepping ourselves on both personal and collective levels of symbolism, the hope is that we're better prepared to engage with Uranus's next long transit rather than being grabbed by it. You guys know I like to use the word grabbed on my YouTube channel in a series we do where we share stories from people. The reason that we use that is the word grabbed comes from the word for planet in the Indian tradition, which is called graha, which means grabber. And in that tradition, the planets can grab us unconsciously as the gods do. And we can also, by reflecting on the presence of the gods and being able to track them and read their signs and omens, we can also reflect upon their meaning in our lives and come to grasp what they're teaching us or what they're showing us. So the dual meaning of the word graha, to be grabbed by or to grasp something, is a really beautiful part of the Indian tradition. And for that same reason, we have this opportunity to look at a transit so that we are not merely grabbed by it. I mean, we're all going to be grabbed by it, right? Because that's part of the process, is making unconscious material conscious to us. And that it's like the big reveal. What will be in the treasure chest? We don't know. But on the level of when we're doing this, what we're doing is we're reflecting upon and entering into the sanctuary of the God. And by doing that with reverence and curiosity, I think that the God's interactions with us are much more personal. And there's nothing more terrifying than living in an objectified universe, a personal universe that speaks personally. It's much more inviting. It's more comfortable. So by doing this, we're also making sure that we're starting to take our sandals off outside of the next temple. Now, along the way tonight, it's my intention to also help students of astrology learn how delineations are put together piece by piece. I like to not just tell you, but I like to show you. So let me show you how this delineation is built so that you can take that material and use it to build your own delineations, as well as actually giving you the delineations. So how the delineation is built. When any planetary delineation by sign alone, we're not using houses or house rulerships because we're not placing Uranus in Gemini into any particular chart in this presentation. We'll look at some charts in particular, but like when we're unpacking the archetypal meaning of a planet in a sign, we are doing that as a way of qualifying the archetypal meaning of the planet and the way it expresses itself by virtue of being in a particular sign. We're not really taking into consideration what house it might be in, which would further modify it. We have to do this because, otherwise we'd be here for days. So we want to start by considering the nature of the planet itself when building a delineation by sign. So Uranus and Gemini, start with Uranus. What does Uranus mean? Then, after we've done that, we think about Uranus expressing itself through the archetypal lens of the planet or planets that rule the sign it occupies. With Gemini, that means Mercury. If it was Taurus, it would be both Venus and the moon because they're joint rulers, moon by exaltation, Venus by rulership. When it's Gemini, we just have one ruler, which is Mercury. So when we think about Uranus expressing itself through the archetypal lens of Gemini, we think about it expressing itself in a mercurial manner. The temple is likened unto the god and the god unto the temple for ancient astrologers, which means that Uranus in Gemini will be a mercurial kind of Uranus. That's really interesting because some modern sort of new age astrologers have sometimes said that Mercury is, or that Uranus is the higher octave of Mercury. Whether that's true or not, it doesn't matter to me personally, but I do think that there's a kind of interesting affinity between the two planets that we'll talk about more as we go. So finally, we then consider the basic sign features of Gemini as additional symbolic modifiers. So for example, Gemini is considered to be a masculine, or you could also call it yang, because we're talking about a metaphysical property, not a gender. Gemini is yang or masculine, double-bodied. It is an air of the air element. It comes at the end of the spring as the light is reaching its apex and will turn the corner and darkness will start to return. So called a double-bodied sign because it's of two natures simultaneously. It sits with a solid sign behind it and a tropical sign in front of it. And so it participates in a transitional state within the story of the light and dark patterning of the solar year. Then we create a synthesis of themes, both personal and collective, both light and dark. So we put it all together and we then look at the spectrum of different themes that come from it. And some of those we will describe or experience, especially in our relative human terms, the language of pleasure and pain, what we like and don't like. We will also find that there are a spectrum of expressions that the planet has that we might also consider morally good or bad. But they're all divine in some transcendental archetypal sense. Anyhow, let's begin. So let's first look at the archetypal Uranus. I use the cosmos and psyche for descriptions of the planets in a lot of my series because it's good to refresh, especially since this is a mixed audience. So Richard Tarnas describes Uranus in the following way in his book. Uranus is empirically associated with the principle of change, rebellion, freedom, liberation, reform and revolution, and the unexpected breakup of structures. With sudden surprises, revelations, and awakenings, lightning-like flashes of insight, the acceleration of thoughts and events, with births and new beginnings of all kinds, and with intellectual brilliance, cultural innovation, technological invention, experiment, creativity, and originality. In addition to the occurrence of sudden breakthroughs and liberating events, Uranus transits are linked to unpredictable and disruptive changes. Hence, the planet is often referred to as the cosmic trickster. Another set of themes associated with Uranus is a concern with the celestial and the cosmic, with astronomy and astrology, with science and esoteric knowledge, and with space travel and aviation. With respect to personal character, Uranus is regarded as signifying the rebel and the innovator, the awakener, the individualist, the dissident, the eccentric, the restless, and wayward. You put it in a nutshell, Uranus is the principle of change with respect to the status quo. Like wherever there's a status quo, eventually it reaches a point where, well, structures can change in many different ways, first of all, but often structures will reach a breaking point where they are overthrown suddenly, swiftly, where new ideas strike people and sudden innovation or original thinking comes and often revolutionizes and replaces old systems or structures or traditions. Revolution can happen within a tradition. Revolution can smash a tradition. There's so many different ways it can take place. But this really is the planet linked to revolution. Revolution can happen spiritually. It can happen psychologically. It can happen in relationships. It can happen in sexuality. It can happen in education. It can happen in science. revelation, awakening, liberation, sudden liberating events. Uranus is also linked to those moments where suddenly you were stuck and now, boom, you're unstuck. Maybe that unstuckness also comes at the cost of some things being broken. I can't tell you how many times I've seen Uranus transit people's ascendant or their seventh house, and their relationship completely breaks apart suddenly and unexpectedly. But it is the most liberating event of their life because it was time to move on. I wish that wasn't the case, but like that happens. Uranus enters people's 10th houses and suddenly they quit or lose their job. Or suddenly they decide to go back to school for something totally different and way in left field compared to where they've been. Uranus is something as kinky and weird and fun as like the Rocky Horror Picture Show and a tattoo on your butt cheek that you get randomly one night. And it is also as original and inventive as the development of the Hubble Space Telescope. So I love this planet. I love it. I've had it on my ascendant the past couple of weeks. I feel like I'm plugged into like a cosmic circuitry. I just am like hit my health a little bit hard at first. Has created some amazing breakthroughs and awakening. Has also been turbulent. So, but it's so interesting. Like, so I've been into astrology for 14 years, full time. So I've lived consciously as an astrologer through Uranus and Aries and now Uranus and Taurus. That's what I've experienced from within the astrological period of my life. So interesting to see the differences politically, collectively, historically, and personally by house and sign. I'm really excited about Uranus into Gemini. So let's talk about Mercury next, because remember, Uranus in Gemini is going to be in the temple of Mercury. Because it will be taking place, this transit, in one of the temples of Hermes Mercury, it's important that we refresh on the archetypal symbolism of Mercury. So, Richard Tarnas, take us there. He says, the principle of mind, thought, communication, that which articulates the primary creative energy and renders it intelligible. The impulse and capacity to think, to conceptualize, to connect and mediate, to use words and language, to give and receive information, to make sense of, to grasp, to perceive, to reason, understand, and articulate, to transport, translate, and transmit. The principle of logos. Now, for the ancients, logos, we get the word logic from, but the logos was like, well, think about the word astrology. Astrologia, which would mean something, I know my Greek probably sucks, but it means the study or the science or the reasoning or the intelligence, all different translations of the word logos, of the stars, of the sky. So Hermes is associated with philosophy. And philosophy itself also has the sense of being connected to the history of what is true. Like logos is sort of like another word for it, literally is word. Like in the beginning was the word, and the word was with God, and that I'm gonna mess that up. Let me actually pull the quote so I can read it because it's a good one. Let's just see here. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So and I remember when I was in college, I studied philosophy, and I had a professor who spoke at length in a lecture that he gave on the influence that Greek philosophy had on the writing of this particular gospel and the way that the word logos is being used in the Greek of the Greek language in the New Testament here. That word logos is really important for the understanding of Uranus and Gemini. because one of the gods associated with Uranus is not really like Uranus, like the ancient Greek god, is really not the best match for the planet Uranus. It's Prometheus is actually the mythological character that most modern archetypal astrologers associate with Uranus. And that um, Prometheus is a light bringer. You know, he brings the fire from the gods to people to liberate them and to give them understanding and knowledge of logos, of like divine knowledge. And Hermes is very similar to Prometheus because he is the messenger of the gods and he is the patron saint, you might say. Or he's a patron and a matron. He's genderless. Uh, he's Hermes is more of a they, you know, but Hermes is the progenitor of astrology itself because astrology was considered to be a divine language of the gods, of reality. That's logos, that's real logos, not just how does shit work mechanically. you know, like that's interesting and there's a lot of things we can do with that. But the difference between using knowledge and information about reality to build empires, to, you know, promote the agenda of colonialism and our rise up hierarchies of wealth and power, and the use of knowledge in that particular way is considered a dark or shadow side of Hermes and how human beings participate in that archetypal field. Just like Mars could be courage, or you could see Mars being used for selfish violence. So Hermes is also about whether knowledge is being used for understanding divinity and being closer to divinity and improving our lives insofar as we become a more spiritual people, or if information is being used to promote egotistical, selfish, greedy, materialistic ambitions. This makes Uranus's trip through Gemini very intriguing. And that connection between Hermes and Prometheus is profound because Prometheus steals the fire from the gods and is also punished for his crime. He's tortured endlessly until Chiron comes and takes his place in one of the stories. But the point being that there is always something potentially transgressive and very complicated about our approach to understanding higher truth. When we get the closer we get to higher truth, the greater the temptations become to use those truths for power. The word, the etymology of the word power, has everything to do with the history of patriarchy and colonialism. The word etymologically is related to possession, to power over other people, to victory and conquest in this military sense of it, to being stronger than other people, to having dominion over others. That's the history of the word power. Whenever knowledge is used for power, it becomes a real shadow. And there's always a temptation for it to go in that direction, which is why the ancients had stories about Hermes as someone that it was like in the sign of Gemini, you have a light and a dark side to everything, even knowledge, wisdom. What do you do with it? Okay, let's talk about the Temple of the Twins in Gemini. We have Jupiter in Gemini aiding us tonight, right? It's like we're calling upon you, Jupiter in Gemini, to help us understand. Gemini is a double-bodied sign, which means that it constitutes one of the four liminal or transitional spaces between light and darkness that occur in the solar year. Now, the zodiac's foundational logic comes from an understanding of the great cycle of light and darkness that constitute the solar year, in case you don't know that. At the outset of Gemini, which takes place in the last 30 days of spring, just prior to the summer solstice, the sun is moving upward toward its highest arc in the sky, which gives us the longest day of the year from the northern hemisphere's standpoint. Remember, all of this is symbolic and archetypal. Don't take it literally. You don't have to flip hemispheres for astrology to work. From this symbolic standpoint of this great circle of light and dark, as oriented originally from the northern hemisphere, at this time of year, the sun is moving up toward its apex. And what happens is, as it is doing so, the momentum of the arc of the sun starts to shift and turn toward sinking. It's really interesting. I have an astronomy program that I use sometimes called Starry Night Pro. And in that program, if you actually day by day, if you watch the ascension of the ecliptic, which is the sun's path, but it's also the defining line of the zodiac. If you watch that line lift through the last 30 days of spring, which is Gemini season, you'll see that as it's lifting, it's like sort of tilting and turning and getting ready to start sinking back down. So the way I would describe it astronomically is that it's like watching a car starting to lean into a big turn that will take it going in the opposite direction, like a big U-turn. And Gemini constitutes the sun starting to ease into that turn. And then by the very end of Gemini, it is now fully going the opposite direction. So Gemini constitutes, for ancient astrologers, the transition between the rising of the light and then Gemini, the turning back to darkness. From the summer solstice forward, the light starts to decline every single day. So think about Gemini as, zodiacally speaking, as the shift from the rising of the light to the sinking of the light within the light half of the solar year. From Aries all the way through Virgo, we're on the light half of the year. Libra to Pisces, dark half of the year. On the light half of the year, Gemini constitutes the end of the rising of light and the beginning of the setting of the light within the light half. This intricacy between light half, dark half, and then the phases of light within the light half and the phases of dark within the dark half is also fundamental to the entire conceptualization of the I Ching in ancient China. So it's really beautiful how so many different mystical schools looked at that movement for metaphysical, philosophical, spiritual wisdom. This handing over from light into dark, rising into setting, is fundamentally tied to the meaning of Gemini and the reason why ancient astrologers placed Hermes, Mercury, there as the ruler. Now, the reason for that is that Mercury, as a planet, resembles this turning point. Because what does Mercury do more regularly than any other planet? It rises up and then it turns and sinks. And it does it more quickly than any other planet. It rises up to its maximal longevity, eastern or western elongation, and then it turns and it descends back into the darkness, into the underworld, and then it rises up again. So Hermes is not only the ruler of Gemini, but also of Virgo for similar reason. Virgo takes us from the light half of the year into the dark half of the year, whereas in Gemini, we have Gemini taking us from the rising of light within the light half of the year to the return of darkness within the light half of the year. Both signs, though, are about a place where you're moving from light toward dark, but in different ways. In both of those places, Hermes is the ruler. Again, the reason for that is that Hermes is the planet that most frequently descends back into darkness, into the underworld. Hermes was called the psychopomp, the guide of souls, and Hermes mythology was connected intimately with the descent and reemergence into Hades and back out. Now, so we have this beautiful connection between Hermes, Mercury, and the double-bodied temple of Gemini. Gemini is also assigned the nature of air and mind, along with the rulership of Hermes Mercury, due to the deconstructive nature of the mind, as well as the fact that the mind operates in and through dualities and opposites like a binary code language. So let me unpack that a little bit. The element of air may have been grafted onto all of the elements may have been grafted onto the early system of the zodiac a little bit later. It may not have been original, in other words. But regardless, it comes to be very quickly associated, Gemini does, with the element of air. And the air element is related to the mind. And Hermes Mercury is obviously a planet that's intimately related to the mind and mental power or energy in general. There's a way in which Hermes is also associated with Earth and Virgo that's very interesting. We have more time to talk about that. Maybe we'll talk about that another time, I mean. The mind, the analytical mind, the mind of Hermes is thought of as a deconstructive analytical mind. It's the mind that takes things apart in order to put them back together. Or natural opposite, by the way, both of Hermes rulerships in Gemini and Virgo are opposite the rulerships of Jupiter in Sagittarius and Pisces. And so there's also a natural way in which Jupiter represented cohesion and unity, and Hermes Mercury represented deconstruction and taking things apart. The natural quality of darkness in the ancient imagination, metaphysically, philosophically, was associated with deconstruction. When darkness comes in, everything falls apart. Think about that from the standpoint of age. As you age, the lightness and brightness in your eyes and your body starts dimming, and you start falling apart. You start decaying. The light of fire that goes down right in the evening, and death comes in, right? It's got to be careful during the night. This kind of thinking was just one of many, many, many different ways that ancient people had of thinking about darkness or yin or the feminine. It meant so many different things, some of them very beautiful and elevated, others like very primal and dark. And the same thing for yang or light. But Hermes rules two signs wherein darkness is rising or darkness is taking over. The darkness starts to rise again within the solar year once we hit Cancer, and darkness takes over in Libra right after Virgo. So those signs of Mercury are also about deconstruction in the sense that darkness is the natural way in which something singular becomes variegated or something whole is broken down into its parts. Which is why, for the same exact reason, Cancer was called, coming right after Gemini, was called the gateway of mankind, where the one descends and disseminates into the many. The one is deconstructed, and rather than being one and whole, it is now many. And in a mysterious way, it's still whole. But that's Mercury, Hermes, to take things apart, to make them variegated. It's a very fascinating thing about astrology, which Hermes rules, by the way. Just a reminder. Interesting thing about astrology is that if you want to understand houses, you have to understand planets, because you can't possibly understand the 12th house from the ancient standpoint until you really understand Saturn. Can't understand the 6th without Mars. But then there's this really crazy way, and you can't understand what a square is without understanding what Mars is. You know, you can't understand what a trine is without understanding what Jupiter is. Can't understand what dignities are without understanding the sun and the moon. Every little pocket of theory in ancient astrology has to be studied in a way like as a fragment. But then the more you study, the more you realize you have to study this thing over here to understand another part over here. This is very Hermes-like in the sense that Hermes is like a mandala. Everything is connected in the mandala, but everything also has its own individual little space. And Hermes is very much about moving from seeing the mandala as just one thing to seeing it as many different things aggregated together. So there's this deconstructive tendency with the mind that is very much like Hermes, that is very much like air, that is very much like the return of darkness happening at this time of year. The gateway of mankind in Cancer, the very next sign where the darkness starts returning, was literally depicted as the descent of the one into the many, the spirit into the form, or forms, plural, or the Ade, the archai, the archetypes, the gods becoming manifest in things like livers and kidneys and all the constituent parts of a human being. Gemini is an active masculine sign because it initiates a process of incoming darkness and deconstruction through the mind. So Gemini likes to take things apart. It likes to ask questions. It likes to probe. It likes to investigate. It's curious, analytical. Gemini was called the temple of Hermes Mercury because Mercury is also a planet who constantly descends into the underworld, deconstructing and eventually reconstructing or emerging again, just as the sun begins its annual descent around Gemini's transitional period. Gemini, like Hermes, is thus a place of intellectual curiosity. This is sort of summary at this point. We've said all of this. Inventiveness, communication, mental stimulation, and the constant playing of the opposites in the mind. The other thing that's really fascinating is that at a transitional space between light and dark, you also have a sign in Hermes that is very good at playing with the light and the dark, which, in other words, are any and all opposites. Reality is thought of by ancient philosophers as a place where the one has become many, and the many is facilitating it. The reason that many different things can exist is because they exist all as a part of one thing in relationship with itself. All of the parts are in relationship with each other, and the main language that holds everything together is a language of binaries, opposites. And the opposites themselves for ancient astrologers had different ways of relating. There were two fundamental ways that opposites could relate. They could relate as dualities, hard, opposed, black, white, never will the two meet, right? Like that. And that there's a whole way in which opposites work like that all the time. That is good, that is evil, that is right, that is wrong. We all live with that kind of duality. And then there's this other way in which opposites exist, which is that they exist along a spectrum, you know, that they move fluidly and that they're not just static categories, but that they're moving, living categories that move in and out of each other all the time. Hermes is thought of as fluid, not because Hermes doesn't recognize gender, for example, metaphysically, but because Hermes both recognizes and doesn't recognize gender at the same time. Acknowledges opposites, works with them, and also plays with them fluidly as though they are real. So they both exist. Uranus and Gemini will thus present through a combination of all of these qualities that we're mentioning here, but especially through the archetypal nature of Gemini's ruler, which is Hermes Mercury. Okay, so it's like scaffolding. We're building our way into an understanding of the light and dark side of Uranus and Gemini. So now I'm gonna lay it on you. So the first major category that I've been working with and developing is, and this is stuff eventually, you'll see little bits and pieces of this on my YouTube channel, I'm sure. The light and dark side of Uranus and Gemini. The first one is the theme of intellectual revolution and fanatical idealism. So Uranus and Gemini will blend the intellectual qualities of airy mercurial Gemini with the revolutionary and innovative qualities of Uranus to produce breakthroughs in how we think, especially in the ideas that we hold to be most valuable or interesting or true, as well as learning and education itself. So it will not be surprising over the 7 years that we see Uranus and Gemini to see on a personal level, to see major breakthroughs in how we perceive, how we think, how we communicate. The ideas that capture our imagination will be truly revolutionary on a personal level. There will be so much learning and breakthroughs in how we think. And not just how we think, but also how we learn. What we learn with, what we use to learn, who we learn from, why we're learning what we're learning. These things will all go through significant changes. There will also be innovation that we'll see socially or collectively in education and institutions of higher learning, in how we think and learn, along with new ideas that will spark major intellectual revolutions societally or culturally or historically. And also, there will be tremendous personal revolution with respect to what we're learning and what ideas are lighting us up inside. So, for example, to illustrate, in the 1940s, Jean Piaget, I think that's how you say his name, developed a series of new ideas about developmental learning in children. And he also became the director of the International Bureau of Education in 1941, a position that he held all the way until 1968. He is one of the, I mean, I'm not saying his ideas are all still relevant or valid today, right? When I look back historically, I'm certainly not suggesting that. But he was a revolutionary figure in the history of developmental learning and early childhood education. Some of his ideas are super dated, and we might even say backward, or but at the time, this was an incredibly Uranus in Gemini like figure. Now, the reason that I mentioned the 1940s, I'm going to see if I can bring this up. A lot of tonight, I'm realizing I should make this more obvious. So give me. Erica, will you tell me if you can see the chart on the screen?
Not yet. Now I can. Now I can.
Can you see it?
You can see it now.
Oh, wait. Okay. Oops. No, I'm struggling here. Sorry. Okay, can you see the, I'm sorry, Erica, one more time. Can you see the chart?
Yes, you have Uranus in the 6th.
Yes. Okay, perfect. So I want to take you guys back in time. You can see I'm just dragging Uranus backward. And almost all, I think all of the examples that I used for tonight's talk come from the last time that Uranus was in Gemini. So that last time that Uranus was in Gemini, right about here. This is August of 1941. And then if we keep going, it would have ingressed again in May of 42. And then it spends in Gemini from about 41, 42. Whoops, let's go to years. All the way until about 1948. So a significant portion of the 1940s, like 41 to 48 roughly. But here, if you go forward in 48, like you'll see that we get a retrograde into Gemini, and it doesn't technically leave into Cancer until 49. So like 41 to 49, all those years include some periods with Uranus in Gemini, and certainly 42 to 48 being like the sweet spot. So that is where I drew a lot of these examples from, and I think I may have failed to mention that in the slides, which I can't believe I did, but there we have it. So now you know, and those listening to the recording will now know why I'm talking about the 1940s. All right, let's put this. Okay. All right. Can you see the presentation again, Erica?
Yeah, it's a full screen though, of your computer. There you go.
Okay. So, Jean Piaget. Or think, for example, of a few of the following revolutionary thinkers and artists who were born while Uranus was in Gemini between 41 and 48. I think this one's really fascinating. Dennis Ritchie, who was born in 1941 with Uranus in Gemini, at the 0 degree marker, by the way, which is where we'll see it next summer. He's the creator of the C programming language. And I'm sure anyone with any kind of computer background knows what that is or knows about that. An incredibly significant part of the language of programming that he developed. Here's someone developing a computer language that was born with Uranus and Gemini. Or let's go to the more avant-garde artistic side of things. Think about Brian Eno, who was born in 1948 with Uranus and Gemini, pioneer of ambient music and electronica. He is someone who revolutionized music in a sense by really doing a lot to incorporate technology and music. I mean, he's like a digital artistic genius. I like that he has Mercury, Hermes in Gemini as well. I think that's really fascinating. A nice trine between Mercury and Neptune as well, too. That really strikes me as an important part of his picture there, too. But Uranus and Gemini. Now, on the other hand, as much as Uranus and Gemini will produce ideas and experimentation with new ideas, ideas about music, ideas about education, development of programming and computers that we just saw. Uranus and Gemini will also produce fanatical thinking and ideas or visions of progress, because remember, Uranus, above all things, likes to go from an old paradigm to a new paradigm. It is very futuristic and progressive as an archetypal field. And so Uranus and Gemini can produce fanatical ideas and thinking or visions of progress that we become somewhat obsessed with. There is always that potential for transgression, for a transgressive use of knowledge. Uranus and Gemini can suggest a blind adherence to whatever is new or trending in the realm of thoughts and ideas or technology. Or it's like whatever we think is new, we think will help us without thinking about it enough. For example, in the 1940s, we saw the peak of fascist regimes in Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy. These ideologies promoted ideas of racial superiority, nationalism, and progress at all costs, and were often supported by various pseudoscientific theories that were being developed at that time about race and genetics. So, like, that's the double-edged sword of Uranus and Gemini, is that we will also see people using science to bolster very aggressive and sort of like potentially delusional ideas of progress. This technology, this idea, this science can back or support some kind of agenda, and the agenda may actually be evil in the case of, like, you know, Nazi Germany or whatever. You see what I mean? Eugenics, which is the pseudoscience of improving the genetic quality of a human population through selective breeding and sterilization, became popular during the 1940s while Uranus was in Gemini, for example, which offered justification for racial segregation and genocide. So just because it's new, just because it's cutting edge, doesn't necessarily make it true, doesn't mean that it's actual progress, doesn't mean that it's actually good for us. So new ideas, new thinking that's not thoroughly tested, that is just immediately utilized without forethought, is also a huge part of what Uranus and Gemini brings. More on that later. You'll see more examples that mirror that same idea. The next thing that I really focused on was the rebellious and revolutionary side of Uranus meeting with the ideological, intellectual side of Gemini, where we have themes of rebelliousness in thought, belief, or ideology. Uranus and Gemini will tend to emphasize playful, experimental ideas, as well as rebellious and defiant and original thinking or beliefs that cut against the grain or that defy the status quo. Cool. I mean, as someone who's progressive and always curious about new things, and I mean, my life wouldn't be what it is if I didn't get interested in things like consciousness and yoga and psychedelics as medicine. And I consider myself to be fairly open-minded. I've got Mars in Gemini. So this is exciting. This to me is like genuinely exciting. I would say that Uranus and Gemini is also about the revolution of unknowing or deconstruction and uncertainty. Because Hermes is deconstructive and likes to call things into question, likes to debate, likes to take things apart as opposed to put them together, is skeptical in some ways by nature. That doesn't mean that Mercury, like Hermes, is not connected with true gnosis, like true knowing, but it does mean that there's a real gift with Hermes and Gemini to like question things, to get to the like Socrates. He was interested in truth, so he had to get through a lot of bullshit, along the way. So Uranus and Gemini is also about the revolution of unknowing, deconstruction, or uncertainty. So you have this avant-garde sense of experimental, rebellious ideas, original thinking, beliefs that cut against the grain or defy the status quo on the one hand, and then you also have this revolution of unknowing or deconstruction or uncertainty on the other. And these both play into that overall theme of revolution on the level of intellect and ideology. Well, when you see that present in art in the 1940s, think, for example, of Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, that was released in 1941 as Uranus had just entered Gemini. Why is that significant? Because this is one of the most, at the time, and still is considered, one of the most experimental leaps in cinematography and film, and like cinema in general, that had been taken to that point and still represents, I mean, just like there's been many great bands since the 1960s, but the 1960s was like this incredible moment for revolution in music. Orson Welles' Citizen Kane is that for film. It goes ahead of its time, challenges the status quo. But then you also have Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness, published in 1943 while Uranus was in Gemini, or Albert Camus' The Stranger, published in 1942 while Uranus was in Gemini. Both call into question this whole idea that there's meaning in things, that you're meaningful, that it calls into question, how much we're projecting onto the universe, the idea of it being meaningful, among other things that are a part of the entire movement of existentialism, which is exploding while Uranus is in Gemini. Don't be surprised if we see a pretty deep level of existential despair, but also excitement. Existentialism is not new. It wasn't new in the 40s. It's been around and been called different things by different people for thousands of years. And at its heart, what does existentialism represent? You could say that it represents a fundamental way of coming into the present moment by stripping ourselves of the myth of meaning. It's like, just get rid of grand narratives. Get rid of, it's very, in a sense, existentialism is very close to some forms of Buddhism. But it's that like, stop telling big stories about reality. Come into the unknowing present. There's a lot of people who feel very enlivened by things like agnosticism or atheism, not because they're they're proudly negating the bullshit of people who believe stuff, right? But because there's something very enlivening about this present moment without any great certainty clouding my ability to experience the present. Now, I'm not saying, I'm personally not a super existentialist or anything, right? But you'll be surprised at how compelling an existential way of thinking will become when Uranus is in Gemini. Also, think about artists like Salvador Dali, who's a surrealist, or Jackson Pollock, called an abstract expressionist, whose works were also deeply influential during the 1940s. And what they did more than anything was just cut against the grain of the status quo in art, just like Citizen Kane and Orson Welles. Let's take things apart and remake them in a way that is not the norm. Let's go against coherence and into magic and chaos. That's Jackson Pollock in my words. Uranus and Gemini can also favor a kind of intellectual nihilism or tendency toward radical deconstruction as just deconstruction that also creates a sense of hopelessness. You got to be careful with that, because what we don't recognize is that even philosophies of unknowing or a refutation of meaning or grand narratives are things that we can become fanatical about. And so rejecting meaning, rejecting God, being a deconstructionist, whatever, can become so fanatical that people can't hold their own philosophy with the same lightness. And so they become hopeless. They're captured secretly by the same monotheism that they were captured by before, you know? I'm just speaking broadly. Born in the 1940s while Uranus was in Gemini, Mick Jagger. Mick Jagger. Does he not strike you as a great? I think it's interesting that he has Saturn co-present, but he just has that electric, mercurial vibe as an artist. Born with Uranus in Gemini. Definitely cutting against the grain as an artist. And doing so in a way that was very, I would also say, very gender fluid. I guess he's still doing it, but Diana Ross, super powerful and electric pioneer in music. Gloria Steinem, a really important figure in the history of feminism, modern history of feminism, and gender equality. That's a very, like, one of the things that you can write it down right now. Uranus in Gemini will be so much about the continued development of sexual rights, sexual freedom, gender expression, the LGBTQ community, and the need to progress the storyline around the rights of different kinds of people with different kinds of non-traditional ways of expressing themselves. This sense of egalitarianism, of freedom, of openness, of polyamory rather than monogamy, of sexual plurality rather than a binary system. These are the kinds of things that Mercury, or that, Uranus in Mercury's sign will stir up. Another theme that I came up with was technological innovation, discovery, and originality. Uranus and Gemini will emphasize themes of innovation and originality, especially with respect to technology and science. Some of these innovations will show up as remarkably useful, while others will be damaging or destructive. Here is that transgressive sense of how we use knowledge or information about reality. The Manhattan Project, 1942 to 45, culminating in the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You don't really think of that as a Uranus event, but it was. It can be described by many different planets, in fact, but Uranus and Gemini is the deconstructing, of atomic energy and how it works and the harnessing of it, and then the immediate use of it without enough like moral reflection. The jet engine was being perfected in the 1940s, a very important, like a remarkable development in aviation. Penicillin began mass production in the 1940s, a remarkable and fast-moving development in the 1940s. A lot of the technologies will move quickly, and that's the problem, is that some of them move too quickly. The ENIAC in 1945 was one of the first general-purpose electronic digital computers that was ever developed. The microwave oven was invented in 1945 while Uranus was in Gemini. The V-2 long-range guided ballistic missile was developed in 1944, which, although immediately had very deadly consequences in warfare, weirdly also led to major breakthroughs in space exploration technology. So space aviation received some big breakthroughs because of the development of this technology, which was also used with devastating effect in war. Transistors were invented at Bell Labs in 1947 while Uranus was in Gemini. That will go on to transistors, as a technology, have a major arc that follows after their development. Nylon and plastics were being rapidly developed in the 1940s without really any thought about what some of them might be doing to the environment. Aerosol spray cans were also being developed and distributed to the masses in the 1940s, again, very quickly without any sense of what long-term effects on the Earth might be. So that's the problem with air, is that it's up here and it really doesn't, it clashes with Earth in a way. Now, there's also a lot with Uranus and Gemini, you'll see a lot of unconventional thinking with respect to gender and sex distinctions. Uranus and Gemini in relation to Hermes will tend to emphasize non-traditional thinking with respect to sex and gender norms, relations, etc. I mentioned this earlier, but here's another chance to look at it. For example, in the 1940s, now the 1940s wasn't exactly the most progressive period, but there are some interesting things to take note of. The first Kinsey report was published on male sexuality and was groundbreaking for several reasons. One, it made clear that same-sex activity in men was way more common than previously believed to be. People thought it was extremely rare. Turns out, according to the Kinsey report in the 40s, it's way more common than people think it is. Made it clear that masturbation is normal and happens regularly for men. There's a lot of shame and guilt that's all of a sudden people are becoming aware of. Made it clear that premarital and extramarital sex was quite common for men. Notice that tendency toward polyamory, polygamy, multiplicity in sex partners. Made it clear that most men enjoy and experiment with diverse sexual activities, not just standard intercourse, in other words. All of this was truly revolutionary for an understanding of sex and the male gender in particular. But okay. So traditional gender roles were challenged during World War II when many women took on roles typically held by men while they were away at war. Think of the iconic image of Rosie the Riveter. We can do it. I can do a man's job. This is something that to us may seem like kind of backward and it's problematic. We look at it now and kind of go, oh, but back then, for women to be working in factories, for women to be doing all sorts of jobs during the war that men did, was truly revolutionary in its own way. Women were becoming very gradually more economically independent during the 1940s. The Equal Pay Act was established in 1943, which was aimed at equal pay for men and women doing the same job in war industries. The UN Charter of 1945 included provisions promoting gender equality and women's rights, which led to a more global recognition of the importance of gender equality. And that's thanks to a lot of the feminists who were doing just really powerful work during the early 1940s. Films during the 1940s also began to explore non-traditional gender roles. For example, I picked just one that was very popular and well-known. The film Mildred Pierce, which was released in 1945, starred Joan Crawford as a single mother striving for success in business while trying to provide by herself for her family. That's not, you're not seeing that in films, and suddenly you are. So we have a lot of breakthroughs around sex and gender norms and roles and so forth. We also have the theme of breakthroughs in communication. Uranus is the breakthrough, Gemini, Mercury is the communication. Uranus and Gemini will also emphasize the importance of new and original ideas, thoughts, or technology directly related to communication itself and the sharing or distributing of information. For example, in 1941, when Uranus was in Gemini, the FCC in the USA issued the first commercial television licenses. Amazing. This is literal forms of information dissemination, or yeah, I guess I would look at TV technology as a way of disseminating information, but obviously you could talk about whether it's information or entertainment or whatever. During the 1940s, the technology was being developed that would lead to the first color TV broadcast in 1950. So the 1940s is gradually developing the technology of color TV. It's like a huge project that's happening throughout the decade. Microwave transmission was being developed in the 1940s. This would help lay the groundwork for eventual commercial telecommunications. The groundwork is being laid while Uranus is in Gemini. Fax machines were being developed in the 1940s. Theoretical groundwork for satellite technology was being developed in the 1940s, all Uranus and Gemini. Magnetic tape recording was also being developed in the 1940s, which would lead to major breakthroughs in consumer audio technology. Think of your boombox. Think of your tape player. Think of your cassette player that can record the radio. Remember those? Starts coming about. The technology starts being developed in the 40s. It's interesting to note that a lot of the technology that's being developed is connected to subsequential breakthroughs, not always immediate breakthroughs. Whereas in other cases, you see immediate uses of technology and the fast and widespread distribution of new technologies, and sometimes without thought for the ramifications of those technologies, what they might lead to. Breakthroughs in cognitive, mental, or psychological thinking. Remember that Hermes is, among other things, interested in the mind itself. How does the mind work is, curiously, an endeavor of the mind, as well as human behavior and mental processes. So Hermes is a planet highly active in the charts of therapists and psychoanalysts and uh, psychologists and so forth, as well as people who just want to understand the brain, neuroscientists and so forth. So we'll see a lot of that when Uranus is in Gemini. For example, in 1943, Abraham Maslow introduced his hierarchy of needs. You may have heard of that before, which starts with basic physiological needs, reaches up into the higher need for self-actualization. So fundamental, there's like a huge breakthrough in the way that we understand human behavior and the hierarchy and prioritization of various needs. B.F. Skinner's work in the 1940s continued to help us understand the principles of operant conditioning. That's huge. During the 1940s, clinical psychology became formalized as a credible profession. So we go from clinical psychology being thought of somewhat marginally to becoming more or less institutionalized. It's now a part of major universities. You can get credentialed. This is a huge development that happens in the 40s. The Rorschach ink blot test becomes widespread during the 1940s, while Uranus is in Gemini. Interestingly, combat stress and PTSD were heavily researched, and more understanding about trauma and trauma-related therapies started emerging during the 1940s in the wake of World War II veterans returning home traumatized from combat. Now, one of the things that Uranus and Gemini can speak to is, remember, Uranus is sudden and disruptive. Gemini, Mercury, and the air quality all represent the nervous system. And so sudden, shocking, traumatic events to the nervous system, as well as research and understanding about shock and trauma and dysregulation versus regulation on the level of mind and the nerves, was a huge part of what started happening in the 1940s. We're going to probably see a lot more breakthroughs in our understanding of trauma and various ways of treating trauma in the next 7 years. Here are some other Uranus and Gemini themes to watch for. Disruption and erratic mental activity as the means by which change and evolution occur. So don't be surprised if personally we experience disruption and sort of an erratic mental activity in our own lives, and that we have to dive deep into an understanding of our own minds and of our nervous system and of what regulation versus dysregulation looks like and how we handle stress. And a lot of how we evolve will be through that medium. Chaos, changeability, and multiplicity as themes that are both creative and destructive. Look, one of the most magical things about Uranus and Gemini, it is the Magician card in the tarot, but it's also a little bit of the Tower card. So think Magician and Tarot and Tower and Tarot combined. Think also about the multiplicity, the many different things happening at once. that can be very creative, but also that can be like unsettling or can, might be hard to feel like we're on stable ground. Nervous excitement, adaptability, flexibility, curiosity, innovation, all as themes that will partner with each other. Now, is that going to enter your 10th house? Is it going to enter your first house, your seventh house? What house it enters will be a huge part of the specific ways in which any and all of the themes we've talked about tonight will appear in your life. If it shows up in your seventh, my God, it's going to be about sex and love and relationships. If it's in your first, it's going to be about your body and your health and your identity. If it's in your 10th, it's your career. If it's your fourth, it's your home or your living environment, and so on and so on. So placing it in the house would be the best, that'd be the best place to start, putting it in a house. Now, here are some suggestions that I have in closing for partnering with Uranus and Gemini. And it's been really nice to develop this talk because it's been an opportunity for me to lay out my first line of thinking about it, Here's my advice. Get clear about what kind of stimulation helps and what harms. For example, I know for myself, beyond 1 cup of coffee in the morning, that stimulation harms. It's a stupid example, but this is the kind of stuff we're going to be wanting to think about. What kinds of environments, what kind of people, what kind of topics, what kinds of things are stimulating you in ways that are creating positive revolution and change and openings in your life versus what kinds of stimulation what kinds of or forms of stimulation are destructive, are dysregulating, are creating chaos, disorder, dysfunction. Starting to think about that now is a good idea. Develop practices of mental grounding. Look, there is no planet in any sign that I can think of, maybe Pluto in Gemini, Neptune in Gemini, but certainly Uranus in Gemini, where it's like, make sure you have some ways of grounding yourself. The opposite in some ways of air is Earth. The ground and the sky couldn't be more separate, right? So how do we ground? How do we feel into our bodies and let our mental energy wash through us without getting dissociated by it? That could be a real thing. So you want to have some practices. Maybe it's a therapist that helps you ground. Maybe it's friendships. Maybe it's dance. It doesn't have to be like you don't have to sit on a cushion and meditate if it's not your thing. Take time to chew on and digest new and exciting ideas before acting. Remember that this energy can be so original, so innovative. The thoughts, the ideas, the learning, the new systems of information that are coming into your life, the new technology, so exciting, so riveting, truly has the potential to change your life. And make sure that you're taking time to digest, reflect, before simply acting on something as quickly as you can. Know that not all ideas will stay or stick. Not all innovative ideas will be worthwhile, and that's okay. More will come, surely, in the 7 years. Talk to Uranus and Gemini regularly and include something on your altar for Uranus. In my humble opinion, if you don't have an altar, even just a statue on your desk, find a totem that can help you connect. Study the whole sign house of Gemini in your birth chart, as well as planets in mutable signs, which Uranus will aspect by square conjunction or opposition over its 7 years in Gemini. Have an astrologer look at those planets. Have an astrologer sit down and look at your chart with you for the whole sign house of Gemini and the transit of Uranus. Okay, that's what I have to say on this subject. I, of course, will be developing more thoughts and ideas, as we get closer to the ingress next year. But yeah, I think I'm going to be doing this in the future. I did a talk a couple months ago on Neptune's entrance into Aries. This is a very similar talk. And I think it's a good way to just start welcoming that transition that's coming. Better than thinking about it for the first time with tons of sensationalism and anxiety 1 month before it happens. That's what I'm trying to avoid.